Hello all. So today we're going to take a closer look at a concept of culture and control. So essentially what we're going to try to get at here is a distinction that's important in sociology, important for what sociology can do for us as far as looking at society and trying to understand society, and looking at two aspects of power really in society that sociology is particularly good at looking at. So we're going to go and define culture a little bit later on here. But for now, let's take a look and see what we're talking about what we mean when we're saying that people are controlled in society. So really then a power in society, we've been talking about this already, but power in society is connected to the extent to which one has one of two things. Either A, material or overt control, which we'll go into detail in a little bit, but direct control over people's lives, usually through force, or two, ideological or covert control, is a management or influence of how people make sense of their world. So we're going to take a closer look at these things, but it's also important, like a lot of things we talk about in this class, material or direct control or ideological control, this emphasis right here in the middle, that these aren't separate from each other. They're always related with each other, but it's useful to take them as two parts so we can better understand how power works. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some examples here. So as far as I think material or overt control is something that's a little bit more obvious. So I think that's really anything in society like police, military, or prison, where anything like if you were to do something wrong, these things would directly confront you, or at least have the implication that they're going to confront you or punish you for doing something you're not supposed to do. So material or overt control is police. So it's basically the direct is the key word here, enforcement of laws, norms, social norms, like things you're supposed to do in society or not supposed to do. It's the person that if you break a law or break these rules, this group or entity or institution will punish you for it. Okay, so in that way, laws and the way society is maintained by one of these groups. So direct control through force. So the part that sociology is maybe more interested in, which isn't completely separate from this, is this idea of ideological or covert control. So let's try to break this word down a little bit. So ideological, you can see the front word there is basically an idea. So it's the ideas that we have in society that shape how what we value, what our goals are, what our beliefs are, really anything that shapes how you make sense of your world. So one of the first examples we have up here is religion. So maybe if you have certain spiritual beliefs of what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, these sort of things shape how we view the world, what our values are, our goals and beliefs are, and thereby helps us act in a certain way. You might also think of schooling. Um, we've all been in schooling for years, this idea of going through K to 12 schooling. If you do something wrong, you're going to be put in a space where you start learning what the proper way to act is. So schooling is an interesting because you might think of a teacher as maybe someone who uses someone that uses direct control. But also a teacher in a classroom also influences ideologies, like what it is to be a good so-called citizen in the United States or to be a good person in society. You learn these things indirectly also. So this is kind of where a teacher can both be someone who's direct and also indirect in controlling you and your values as you come up. And we could also see this in parenting. So any of these ideas, these things that start influencing us in a hidden manner. So I'd like to emphasize that, like we said, that these aren't separate from each other. But the important part here ends up becoming that as these things work together, it starts shaping who we are. So society then, we'll talk about culture in a little bit, but society then is made up of material or direct control, M for material, or ideology, indirect control. So we're constantly in a sea of different ideas, different institutions and forces that are trying to influence us to see things a certain way. And the interaction between these two things ends up making us who we are as the individual. What your individual values are, what your beliefs are shaped by these interactions we have. And I think it's also important to emphasize that in sociology, then, these things, material and ideological, do not completely control everything the individual is, but they're going to have a strong influence on that. To an extent that where even if maybe you want to do one thing, do your own thing over here, you may not be able to simply because it's just not allowed in your culture. Whether it's anything as small as something that might be viewed as deviant behavior, like maybe drug use, to even being with a partner of whom you love, if it's not taken as something that is acceptable in society. So individuals are constrained by social rules, whether that's indirect or direct. So a big thing then, and what sociology ends up becoming interested in, is looking at ways in which these shape us. So a term that ends up meaning that is culture. So someone's culture, your shared beliefs or ideologies among a group of people in a given space. So this could be as direct as the culture of a family unit, like what your family directly believes, to maybe even more broadly what culture your family comes from believes, to even as big as a nation or a country, what a country believes. But culture is made up of two things. It's also material. So we think of material things as artifacts. So your culture is physical, things that we create, styles that we wear, music that we listen to, food that we cook and eat. These are all material pieces of what makes up a culture. So physical things you could touch. But just like we talked about before in sociology, culture is also ideological. So it is the values and beliefs of a society or group. It is important to understand that ideology is subjective. So it's a person's understanding of what their culture values, or how they interpret these beliefs. But these things are also going to be influenced by society. So culture itself is the shared beliefs, and these are physical as well as ideological, and these help shape who we are, right? So a big question then, and we kind of know where culture as a material thing comes from, like the food and we eat, music we listen to, things like that. However, the big question in sociology then, where do these ideas come from? So if who we are, if we look back up here again, if the individual is so strongly influenced by society, then it's probably important for us to understand where these ideas come from, right? So I think if we were to ask this live to a group of people, you probably immediately think of a few things like politics and media, power of influencers on people who put these values out there. So these stories, like when we talked about last week with the interactionism idea, these stories, these beliefs actually shape who we are. So at the interactionist belief system, like we had two people interacting with each other, it's this interaction here in the center. This interaction could actually go up and create our reality. So this reality is social reality, is created by our interaction. So we're interested in what the content of that is. So as a sociology, then we're interested in politics, we're interested in social media, we're interested in movies and music, and how these things being put out in the world actually change our reality. Okay, so this final part here then is that stories have consequences. So while we, on one hand, we could say things are not real, that a story is not a real thing, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, but in sociology though it's not real, it does have real consequences. Real consequences. So even though something's not real, you can't touch it and feel it, the stories that we tell ourselves have real consequences. So the example we like to give for this is that even though race doesn't exist biologically, there's not real differences biologically in races, the belief in separate races leads to racism and oppression. So while race is not real, it can have real consequences resulting in oppression and death and marginalization of people. It can also be in a more positive in democratic beliefs, while believing in equality and change itself isn't something physical. Really strongly believing in these things and trying to make these things a reality can help you move towards change. Okay. So in sociology, then, we're not just interested in what's real and tangible, we're also interested in the consequences of these things that we tell ourselves, these stories. Okay. So then, where does power come in? So the big question then I'm going to ask is, if stories are so consequential, if a story that we tell ourselves could actually change history, change our reality, then who gets to tell these stories? Who is the one that gets to tell these stories in our society? If they have such consequences, we want to know who's telling our stories, right? So we'll talk about this kind of throughout, but this idea of history, then history and cultural narratives are shape how we story ourselves, how we understand our country, how we understand our people. And these actual stories can actually change our experiences. So we ask this question then, what is your experience with history? What did you experience history as growing up? Did you see history about people that look like you? Was history about common people? Was history about presidents and rulers? What did history look like? And if we take that example of if history just looks like presidents and rulers, and what does that make what does that make our current society look like? What's the result? In opposition, if you actually had history that was written by workers or common folks, so-called common folks, the everyday person, what would that history look like? What would war look like? What would social change look like? So it's not only important on who's telling the story, but what story is being told and how is it communicated. Okay, so one of the things then we emphasize throughout, and also goes into like alternative assignments, is what can we learn then from the media? So if we really take this idea seriously, is then we could also look then at our media, our film, TV, social media consumption, and ask us what do these stories tell us about ourselves. So for example, some folks actually do this, they look at things like horror movies. So by looking at horror movies, what can this tell us about what we fear? What can this tell us about our own social values? So one of the things we might look at is about 10 years ago when they had the paranormal activity movies talking about the haunting of people's homes by ghosts, where people actually losing control of their homes. This also happened to be taking place during the Great Recession when a bunch of people are losing their homes. And maybe you could think of current examples of horror movies that are coming out right now. What are we afraid of now? What's coming out in these horror films? What's coming out in major motion pictures, music, and TV? What are these things telling us about what our values are, what we care about, what we're afraid of, and what we love? Okay, so this idea then of media and culture ends up becoming a big way to look at ourselves, kind of look at the mirror of society to understand what's going on. So a second way to look at this, actually two people, Horkheimer and Adorno. They're two professors that were writing after World War II, and they're actually Jewish academics that escaped fascism and Nazism to the United States. And one of their big thing after the war became trying to understand how did this happen? And more importantly, how could it happen again? Could it happen in the U.S.? Could this happen in the United States? That was the big question they were looking at. So one of the things they had trouble with was that they would end up arguing that it's not just fascism was unique and just a German thing. They were seeing this kind of taking place all over the world, this idea of mass culture. So they would use the example of the assembly line. So this idea of a factory producing a bunch of things that look the same. So we no longer have mom and pop shops doing small unique batches. We're thinking of big things like Walmart or Amazon making really big batches of everything being the same. So what they ended up arguing, Horkheimer and Adorno, was that mass media and culture, film specifically is what they were talking about in their time period, started to become something that was being mass made. This idea then there's no longer small ideas and it's just mass produced. Art is becoming mass produced, that is trying to sell a lot of tickets to as many people as possible. So their concern was then this idea that there's not that many conflicting ideas. If everything is mass produced, you end up getting less new ideas. It becomes easier and easier to kind of look at the same. So you're not getting new ideas, you get a lot of the same ideas. So they were writing about this in the 50s and 60s, and I can imagine what they would be saying now with this idea of how social media might affect this. So they were concerned that this idea of social control, that the more media looked the same, the more people had the same values, the less freedom people would have. So looking at the influence then of consumer capitalism, if media is mass produced and there's less and less people, so monopolies, there's less and less groups producing media, and more likely you can have this one view of everything. And especially as you start looking as the United States specifically starts sending its media out into the world, media becomes global. So then everyone starts being able to consume the same ideas across the entire world. And this was them talking about film. So what happens in social media when people literally have the ability to reach out across the world with one post, one social media post, with one group of ideas? Does this help us change? Can we imagine a new world? So their concern was then, if we can't, one of the main concerns is really important here. If we can't imagine a new world, then we can't create a new world. So they're worried that if imagination is controlled, how do we change society? If our imagination can change the world, and we lose our ability to imagine new things, how can we imagine a better world? Is their main concern. So let's apply this in an activity then, as far as imagining a new world. So you may have come across this term before. So if we're trying to work on our imaginations, this idea then of utopia. The word utopia just means an imaginary perfect world. Maybe you could look this up and go into a little bit more depth. But utopias are things like heaven. Heaven is not necessarily imaginary, but this idea of heaven, the perfect world, something just beyond our reach. Something like heaven, something like Atlantis. Even some fictional films are talking about utopias. So as you're looking at the perfect world, so one of the critiques about this then is people suggest that utopias are possible, and you could judge this for yourself. Some folks say that utopias are not possible. It's impossible to have a perfect world. So one way I'd like to suggest them. So thinking about that, that's one thing to think about. Do you think a utopia is possible? And the part two is, how can it be useful then? So let's just say that it is impossible to have a utopia. Why would it be useful? So one of the ways we could think about this, and this is what we're going to try to do today, is can it be used as a way to get to our goal? So if we're able to imagine the perfect world and move towards it, even though we're never able to get there, maybe it would help us know we're moving in the right direction. So if this is the perfect world, PW is a perfect world, maybe we don't ever quite get there as a people, as a society. We may not always get there, but at least that we would know about this journey. We would know whether this checks out as being consistent with this perfect world. So it's about the journey then. If we have a new policy on things, is something like having universal income, as something like having free school or free education, is that something that would be consistent with your perfect world? So in doing this then, and trying to imagine this journey, imagine how we might get to the perfect world, maybe you all could imagine your own utopia. So it's sort of a discussion project, and these could be any of these, but what might your utopia look like? If we're talking about ideologies, what would be the ideologies? What would be the material things that would be in your perfect world? And how might things be different? So let's just take school, for instance. The ideology of school, maybe schooling would be, rather than focused on students following the teacher perfectly, maybe it would be about how people could become really good critical thinkers And materially, a new school, maybe it would be free. Like all the way through university, that would be free. So in your utopia, the ideology, the ideas behind it, and the material things, in this case, democratic schooling where everyone's equal, and material conditions, schooling's free. So you can use any one of these examples, anything that comes to your mind. How might social media look different? How might movies look different in this perfect world? Would it look the same as it does now? How might it be different? And given that, what does it say about our current society if it does or doesn't match up with our ideal world?